They say there are moments when the air itself feels heavy, and the world holds its breath, as if waiting for something to be revealed. That morning at Oak Hill Cemetery, gray fog blanketed the earth like a shroud, swallowing the old gravestones and the living alike. Rain fell in a steady, relentless curtain, soaking through the black umbrellas of mourners who clustered around the fresh grave of Eli Foster. Jasper's fur dripped with water as he circled the grave. He was a German shepherd, large and proud, but today his ears lay flat and his tail drooped low. Beside him, Harvey, a scrappy mutt with bright eyes and a limp, paced anxiously, while Maple, a golden retriever, shivered, whining under her breath. The three dogs moved together in a strange, desperate orbit, paws turning up muddy earth, their bodies tense with energy that had nowhere to go. The townspeople watched them with uneasy fascination. Nobody said it, but everyone felt it. This was not normal. Dogs didn't mourn like this. They didn't pace and circle and refuse to be led away, no matter how gentle the voice or tempting the treat. Cassie, standing at the edge of the crowd in her police uniform, felt a chill prickle down her spine. Not from the rain, but from the memory of her own father's funeral years ago, and the family's old collie Lady, who'd lain beside the casket until sunset, refusing to move. Loyalty, her father had said, was the truest measure of a heart. The priest's voice rang out over the cemetery, gravelly and low, reading from a worn Bible, but even he kept glancing over at the dogs. Ashes to ashes, dust to... His words faded as Jasper stopped, planted his feet, and stared at the closed casket with an intensity that was almost human. Maple whimpered and pressed her wet nose into Jasper's side. Harvey sat down hard, muscles rigid, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the mourners, as if searching for someone. Cassie caught the eyes of Eli's niece, Mara, who looked close to tears, clutching a tissue in both hands. The dogs had always been Eli's world, more constant than any family. Now, it was as if they alone understood what had truly been lost. The priest cleared his throat, finished the prayer, and nodded. May he rest in peace. And then, as if on cue, Jasper threw back his head and howled, a long, haunting note that rose above the patter of rain and the quiet sobs of the living. It was a sound that seemed to twist through the fog, shivering through bone and memory alike. People turned, startled. A few even flinched. No one spoke. Cassie felt something tighten in her chest. There was pain in that howl, raw and wild and full of grief. The other two dogs joined in, their voices weaving together in a strange, discordant chorus, until the cemetery echoed with a music older than words. Some of the mourners crossed themselves. Others simply stood, faces pale, as the dogs' cries faded into the hush that followed. The funeral broke up slowly, people drifting away, eyes averted from the grave and the animals that still kept their vigil. Mara tried to coax Maple with a piece of jerky, but the dog only pressed closer to Jasper, refusing to budge. A gravedigger muttered something about bad omens and spat into the grass. An elderly woman in a red scarf whispered, "If the dogs won't leave, the dead can't rest." And Cassie's skin prickled again. As the crowd thinned, Cassie lingered, watching the trio. I saw how Jasper pawed at the freshly turned earth, how Maple's chest heaved with each shaky breath, how Harvey never took his eyes off the faces around him. There was more here than simple mourning, something deeper, something fierce. The police radio at Cassie's hip crackled, reminding her of the world outside. But she stayed rooted, unable to look away. The rain picked up, thunder rumbling low across the hills, but still the dogs would not leave. The cemetery workers avoided them, pretending not to see as they packed up their tools and slipped away. It was only Cassie who remained, standing under a battered umbrella as the sky darkened, thinking of all the things she'd lost, and of the bond between the living and the dead. A bond that sometimes refused to break, no matter how much time or rain might fall. Jasper's eyes met hers, sharp and golden and full of questions she couldn't answer. In that moment, Cassie felt a strange kinship, as if some invisible line had been drawn between them, binding her to the dogs and their mysterious grief. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders, and wondered if, perhaps, the dead weren't the only ones who struggled to find peace. As twilight fell over Oak Hill Cemetery and the last mourner disappeared into the mist, Jasper lifted his head one more time and let out a final, shuddering howl, an echo of loss and a promise that the story was far from over. By the time dusk settled over Oak Hill Cemetery, the world felt even smaller, shrunken by rain and thickening fog. The crowd had long since vanished, their footsteps washed away by the storm, but Jasper, Harvey, and Maple still huddled at the grave, unmoved by time or weather. Cassie leaned against the iron fence, hood drawn up, her flashlight flickering as she checked her watch for the third time in as many minutes. The sun was only a rumor behind the clouds, and the temperature dropped with each passing hour. Thunder rolled over the distant hills, lightning flashing so close that it lit up the jagged stones and the twisted branches of the old oaks. Rain came in sheets now, turning the cemetery paths into rivers of mud, but still the dogs wouldn't leave. Cassie's shift should have ended hours ago, but she'd radioed the station to say she'd stay. Something about this vigil felt important. Maybe not for the law, but for the soul. Jasper lay pressed against the headstone, his fur matted and heavy with rain. He ignored the food Cassie had left nearby. Canned beef stew, his favorite, according to Eli's niece. Harvey nosed the tin once, then turned his back, shaking his head as if in protest. Maple paced along the grave's edge, her tail drooping, every so often pawing at the earth, as if searching for something just beneath the surface. Cassie tried coaxing them with her gentlest voice. "Come on, guys. It's freezing out here. You can't stay all night." But their eyes shone with a stubborn, mournful determination. It was as if they'd made a pact with the dead. As midnight approached, the wind began to howl, rattling the branches and making the cemetery gates creak. Cassie tucked her chin deeper into her jacket and hunched under her umbrella. The only light came from her flashlight, slicing through the rain, and from the glow of the street lamp by the gate, its light distorted by mist and water. Occasionally, the beam would catch Jasper's eyes, golden and glassy, reflecting back her own exhaustion. Suddenly, a voice cut through the storm, a quavering, conspiratorial tone. "If the dogs won't go, the dead can't rest," muttered Mrs. Delaney, an old woman from the far side of town. She stood just inside the cemetery gates, her red scarf whipping in the wind, eyes locked on the huddled animals. "It's a bad sign, officer. My mother always said, 'Animals see what we cannot.'" She shook her head, clutching her umbrella tighter, before disappearing into the night. Her words lingered, settling on Cassie's shoulders like a second, colder rain. The storm raged on. Each hour seemed to bring fresh tension. Branches snapped overhead, the ground shifted, and somewhere a fox screamed in the distance, adding a wild edge to the night. Cassie's thoughts drifted back to Eli, to the way he'd always walked his dogs past her station window, rain or shine, offering a wave and a smile that spoke of someone who understood the quiet rituals of grief. She found herself wondering what the dogs were waiting for, what they might know or sense that she did not. Just before dawn, the rain eased, replaced by a thick, unnatural silence. Cassie stood, bones aching and stretched. She noticed something strange. The grave looked different. The earth was disturbed. Claw marks raked through the mud in uneven lines, fresher and deeper than before. She knelt down, examining the scratches. They weren't from shovels or tools. These were the desperate work of paws, dirt packed under the nails, evidence of a sleepless, ceaseless watch. She took a deep breath and reached out, her fingers brushing Jasper's soaked fur. He flinched at first, but didn't run. Maple whined and pressed close to Harvey. The three of them seemed spent, as if the storm had wrung them out, but left their purpose intact. Cassie's unease grew. Was this devotion, or something darker? Did they know something the rest of them were blind to? The hairs on her arms rose as she considered the possibilities. Ghost stories, superstitions. The idea that animals could sense unrest or injustice in ways humans could not. She checked her phone. Dead. The battery drained by the cold. The rest of the world felt impossibly far away. As dawn broke, pale and uncertain, Cassie was forced to make a decision. The dogs weren't safe here, not with exhaustion in their eyes and the storm returning in fits and starts. She couldn't leave them, but she couldn't drag them away by force either. So she took a chance. Fishing the spare leash from her car, she moved slowly, speaking softly, letting the dogs sniff her hands and the fabric, reassuring them with the patience of someone who'd lost and loved deeply. After several tense moments, Jasper finally allowed her to slip the loop over his neck. Harvey followed, limping beside Maple, who trembled but didn't fight. Cassie loaded them gently into the back of her patrol SUV, covering them with a wool blanket she kept for emergencies. Driving through empty streets, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Tired eyes, hair plastered to her forehead, uniform stained with mud. The dogs sat in silence, pressed against each other, staring out the window as the cemetery faded from view. Cassie spoke quietly, more to herself than to them. "We'll figure this out, I promise." She drove them to the small police kennel behind the station, where the night shift officer looked up, surprised. "Bringing in strays, Cass?" he joked, but fell silent at the look on her face. She signed the intake forms herself, scrawling her name beside the description. 3 dogs, rescued from Oak Hill Cemetery, refused to leave grave. Observed unusual behavior, she sat with them a while, stroking Jasper's damp fur and offering fresh water. None of the dogs ate, but at least they seemed calmer in the quiet warmth of the kennel. Outside, the storm battered the windows, but inside it was just the 4 of them, bound together by exhaustion and uncertainty. When the vet arrived later that morning, she checked the dogs over and shook her head. "They're healthy, just stressed. Never seen animals so loyal or so stubborn." She smiled, but there was a trace of concern in her eyes too. As Cassie closed the kennel door, Harvey let out a low, uncertain bark, and Jasper stared at her, as if trying to communicate something vital, something just out of reach. Cassie felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She didn't know what the dogs had seen or sensed, but she was certain of one thing. This story wasn't over. There were questions buried with Eli Foster, questions that seemed to rise, restless and demanding, with every passing hour. As she walked away, the wind picked up again, rattling the glass, and she glanced back at the dogs, 3 sentinels, waiting for a truth only they could reveal. The rain had faded to a steady drizzle by the time night fell over the police station, but Cassie couldn't shake the chill that had settled into her bones. The small kennel behind the station was little more than a converted storage shed. Cement floors, chain-link pens, heat lamps glowing with tired orange light. Cassie found herself there long after her shift had ended, leaning against the doorway and watching the dogs through the mesh. Jasper lay curled up at the far end of his pen, his head resting on his paws, eyes fixed on the door as if he expected someone important to walk through at any moment. Maple and Harvey, huddled together in the adjacent pen, flinched each time thunder rolled across the night sky, their bodies trembling with every rumble. The air inside was warm, but their anxiety made the room feel colder than it was. Cassie tried to busy herself with paperwork, but her mind kept circling the same thoughts, picking at them the way Jasper had picked at Eli Foster's grave. She wondered if the dogs could sense her uncertainty, if grief had its own scent, as unmistakable to them as fear or loyalty. It was nearly midnight when Cassie gave up pretending to work and pulled a folding chair over beside Jasper's pen. He lifted his head, ears pricking, but didn't move away as she sat down. For a long time, she just watched him in silence. The only sound, the soft, anxious panting from Maple and the distant drip of water from a leaky pipe. "You miss him, don't you?" she murmured finally, not expecting an answer. "I know what that feels like. When my dad passed, it was like the world tilted, and nothing felt steady for a long time." She glanced at her hands, noticing how tightly she was gripping her own knees. The memory of her father's sudden death still felt raw, even though years had passed. The funeral, the endless casseroles from neighbors, the emptiness of a house stripped of laughter, and Lady, the old collie, lying by the door for days, refusing food, waiting for someone who would never come home. Jasper watched her with steady, unblinking eyes. There was an intelligence there, a grief as sharp as any human's, but also a resilience she recognized. Cassie reached through the chain link, slow and gentle, letting him sniff her fingers. This time he didn't flinch. After a moment's hesitation, Jasper pressed his head against her hand. She felt the rough warmth of his fur, the subtle tremor of his breath. It was a small act of trust, but it broke something open in Cassie's heart. Harvey, watching from the next pen, whimpered softly, and Maple licked his ear, as if to comfort them both. Cassie felt the tears prick her eyes but blinked them away. She needed to focus, to figure out what had the dogs so obsessed, and why their devotion seemed edged with desperation. She stood and fetched a towel, kneeling to dry Jasper's head and neck as best she could. As she worked, her hand brushed something odd beneath his fur, a patch of skin rough and swollen. She parted the thick hair and found a healing wound, still red and angry, hidden on his shoulder. Not fresh enough to be from the grave, but recent all the same. Cassie frowned. "Where did you get this, buddy?" Jasper stared at her, as if trying to will the words into her mind. She made a mental note to have the vet take another look. It could be nothing, a scrape from a fence, a run-in with a stray, or it could be something more. She couldn't shake the feeling that the dogs knew something the rest of them didn't. That maybe, just maybe, Eli's death wasn't as simple as it seemed. Later, sitting at her desk, Cassie pulled out the battered manila folder containing Eli Foster's will. Mara had dropped it off earlier, insisting the family wanted everything handled properly. Cassie read the document 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Eli Foster had left nearly everything, not to his relatives, not to charities, but to his dogs. Jasper, Harvey, and Maple were now, on paper, the inheritors of a modest fortune. Eli's house, his savings, even the old pickup truck rusting in the garage. The will was witnessed and notarized, no sign of coercion or confusion. Cassie's brow furrowed. Why leave so much to 3 animals? Sentiment was one thing, but this was a fortune by small-town standards. She jotted a note in her pad. Possible motive? Was there someone who stood to benefit from Eli's death, or someone angry at being left out? Had the old man been killed, not by fate, but by greed? The idea twisted in her stomach. Eli Foster had always seemed gentle, unassuming, a fixture in the town, never one to stir up trouble. She remembered the way he'd spoken to his dogs in the park, his voice soft and full of warmth, even when nobody was watching. Who would want to hurt a man like that? Thunder boomed again, and a sharp wind rattled the window panes. Cassie thought of Jasper's wound, of the dog's refusal to leave the grave, of the uneasy way Maple paced, never settling for long. She wondered what had happened in the days before Eli's death. What secrets might still be buried, waiting for someone to dig them up. She closed the folder and went back to the kennel, unable to rest. This time Jasper rose to greet her, pressing his nose into her palm with a low, uncertain huff. Cassie knelt beside him, letting him lean into her warmth, and for the first time since the funeral, she felt a flicker of hope. Grief was a heavy thing, but it didn't have to be carried alone. Maple and Harvey edged closer, their tails thumping tentatively against the kennel wall. The four of them sat together in the quiet, sharing the burdens of the living and the lost. Cassie knew the coming days would be full of questions, some she might not want answered. But she also knew that, whatever else happened, she would see this through. She owed it to Eli. She owed it to herself. And most of all, she owed it to 3 brave dogs whose loyalty ran deeper than any grave. Underscore, 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 underscore. The storm finally broke at sunrise, leaving the town glazed with a brittle sheen of damp and scattered branches, as if the world itself had been scoured clean overnight. Cassie's boots splashed through puddles as she made her way down Sycamore Lane, her mind replaying the previous night's questions like a song she couldn't turn off. The 3 dogs, Jasper, Harvey, Maple, were safe in the police kennel, but their haunted eyes and stubborn loyalty lingered with her, gnawing at the corners of her thoughts. She was on her way to the Foster house, a modest bungalow, white paint peeling, front yard choked with overgrown grass, and the sad remains of last year's flower beds. Mara had agreed to let Cassie look around, hoping it might help explain Eli's sudden death and the dog's strange devotion. As she knocked, Cassie could hear the echo of barking, distant but urgent, as if the house itself was remembering happier times. Inside, Mara looked pale and exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. She led Cassie into the front room, where dust motes spun lazily in morning light. Photos lined the mantel. Eli smiling, holding a leash in each hand. Jasper and Maple as puppies, tumbling through the snow. Harvey, scarred but grinning, napping by Eli's boots. The house felt lonely, every surface lined with the fingerprints of a life spent in quiet devotion. "I know it seems odd," Mara began, fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "But Uncle Eli wasn't crazy. He just loved those dogs. Saved them all, really. Found Jasper abandoned near the tracks during that awful blizzard 3 winters ago. Maple was left tied to a fence post out by the highway, and Harvey, well, someone dumped him after he got hit by a car. Eli never let anyone say a bad word about them. Families who stays, he used to tell me." Cassie nodded, guilt pricking her. She'd arrived looking for motives, for hints of foul play or resentment, but hearing about Eli's acts of quiet heroism softened something inside her. She glanced at the photos, trying to imagine the house filled with laughter, the sound of paws thumping on old floorboards. Eli's gentle voice reading out loud from his battered armchair. "He was lonely after my aunt passed," Mara continued, her voice thick. "The dogs kept him going. He talked to them more than he talked to most people." Cassie smiled a little. "Animals get under your skin. They see you, really see you, even when you're at your worst." They toured the house together, Cassie taking notes but mostly listening. The kitchen still smelled faintly of bacon and coffee. The sink stacked with dishes Eli never got around to. On the fridge were lists written in looping script. Buy dog food, call vet, fix Maple's collar. In the back bedroom, Cassie found an old quilt, chewed at the corners, and a basket of mismatched tennis balls. The house radiated love and loss in equal measure. Outside, Mara unlocked the garden shed and showed Cassie where Eli kept dog treats, leashes, and an old first aid kit. He always said, "Be ready for storms and scrapes." Never knew when someone would show up on the porch, lost or hungry. She hesitated, then handed Cassie a faded Polaroid. Eli and the dogs, standing in front of a log cabin deep in the woods, sunlight dappling the leaves above their heads. "I don't know where this was taken," Mara admitted. "He never talked about a cabin, but he looked happy there." Cassie studied the photo. It was recent. Eli's beard was gray, Jasper full-grown. The cabin didn't match any property listed under Eli's name. Something about the angle, the way the trees crowded the frame, gave her the sense of a place meant to be hidden. She pocketed the picture, mind racing. Before leaving, Cassie asked if she could try bringing the dogs home. Maybe being back would give them closure, let them say goodbye. Mara agreed, and soon Cassie was back at the kennel, leashes in hand, nerves jangling. The drive to the Foster house was tense. Maple pressed her nose to the window, ears drooping. Harvey trembled beside her, tongue flicking nervously. Jasper sat bolt upright, eyes scanning every yard and driveway as if searching for Eli's familiar silhouette. As Cassie parked and opened the door, Jasper leapt out first, nose twitching, tail low. They approached the house together. Cassie unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting the dogs choose their own path. Maple darted to the kitchen, sniffing every inch, then whining at the empty food bowl. Harvey circled the living room, barking once, then collapsing in a heap by Eli's battered recliner. But Jasper stood on the threshold, chest heaving, refusing to enter. He stared into the shadows of the hallway, hackles raised, and gave a low, mournful whine. Cassie knelt beside him, murmuring reassurances, but Jasper wouldn't move. It was as if the house had become alien, hallowed ground he could no longer cross. "Take your time, big guy," Cassie whispered, rubbing his ears. After several long minutes, Jasper finally edged forward, only to stop in front of the fireplace. He pawed at a framed photo, knocking it to the floor. Cassie picked it up. Eli and the dogs again, but this time the backdrop was different. The same cabin from the earlier photo, only now with snow piled high on the roof, smoke curling from the chimney. Cassie's heart pounded. There was something about that cabin, something Jasper wanted her to see. She checked the back of the frame and found a slip of paper, yellowed and creased, with an address scrawled in shaky handwriting. The location was on the far edge of the county, deep in the woods. Nowhere near any of Eli's official property lines. Jasper whined and nudged Cassie's arm as if urging her onward. She hugged him tightly, feeling his ribs beneath the thick fur. "We'll find out what happened. I promise." As she loaded the dogs back into the car, Cassie glanced once more at the Foster house. The sun was climbing higher, burning away the fog, but the windows remained dark, the silence inside unbroken. She thought of Eli, how much he'd given, how quietly he'd lived, and of the 3 dogs who now depended on her to uncover the truth. Back at the station, Cassie spread out the photos, notes, and the slip of paper, building a timeline. She called the county office. No record of a cabin at that address, but an old logging road cut through the area. Few people went there anymore, especially after the last storm washed out the bridge. She stared at the photo, tracing the outline of the cabin, wondering what secrets it held. In the adjacent kennel, Jasper paced, stopping every few minutes to stare at Cassie as if willing her to hurry. Maple and Harvey pressed close, their trust and fear mirrored in their dark, liquid eyes. Cassie understood, now more than ever, that the bond between Eli and these dogs ran deeper than simple affection. It was a promise, one forged in hardship and solitude, tested by storms and loss. She felt a responsibility blooming in her chest, fierce and unfamiliar. This was more than an investigation. It was a search for justice, and for the meaning of loyalty itself. As twilight settled over the town, Cassie loaded the dogs and her gear into her SUV, her destination set, the hidden cabin in the woods. The case was no longer just about Eli's death. It was about what survived him, the ties that bound the living to the lost, and the secrets that waited, patient as old dogs, to be found. Oak Hill Cemetery looked different in the harsh light of afternoon, a place between worlds, caught somewhere between the hush of the dead and the murmurs of the living. It was there, among crooked stones and tangled weeds, that everything changed. Cassie was at her desk, reviewing the cabin clue for the 5th time, when her police radio squawked to life, urgent and frantic. "Officer Daniels, Cassie, there's something going on at Oak Hill. The dogs, Jasper and the others, they're back. You better get down here now." Her heart leaped into her throat. She dropped her pen and bolted for her car, barely remembering her jacket or the keys, as she sped through the narrow streets, windshield wipers beating frantically against sudden rain. Her mind reeled. How had the dogs escaped? Who let them out? Or was this something they needed to do, something no lock or leash could hold back? When Cassie arrived, she saw a crowd had gathered, curiosity and dread mingling in the air. Cemetery workers, neighbors, kids skipping school. Even the priest in his black coat. Everyone drawn by the spectacle of 3 dogs tearing at Eli Foster's grave with a single feverish purpose. Jasper's powerful shoulders heaved with the effort, claws raking through wet earth, flinging clods of mud behind him. Maple's golden fur was already streaked with dirt, her paws bloodied from the frantic digging. Harvey limped but worked just as desperately, grunting, whimpering, as if nothing else in the world mattered. The townsfolk whispered, faces drawn and pale. They say animals sense things we can't. Maybe it's the ghost of old Eli. "I told you that grave wasn't right." Cassie pushed through the crowd, her uniform slick with rain and sweat, heart pounding. "Move aside. Everyone, please, give the dogs space." Her voice was strong, but her insides twisted with fear. She'd never seen animals behave like this, not with such raw, single-minded desperation. The dogs barely acknowledged her as she dropped to her knees in the mud beside them. "Jasper, stop. You're hurting yourself." She tried to grab his collar, but he shrugged her off, a growl rumbling low in his throat. Not at her, but at whatever barrier still separated him from the truth. Maple yelped suddenly as a man in a work vest tried to pull her back. "Easy there, she'll bite," someone shouted, and Cassie spun, leveling the worker with a warning glare. "Nobody touches these dogs. Let them finish." It was an order, and more than that, a plea. Deep down, Cassie felt the same thing they did, an itch in her bones, a sense that whatever was about to happen needed to happen, no matter how strange. The ground was giving way now, mud collapsing as Jasper and Harvey clawed deeper. The scent of earth and rot rose, thick and cloying, mixing with the tang of blood from Maple's torn paw pads. The storm clouds gathered again, thunder muttering threats as shadows crept across the graveyard. Cassie's radio crackled, but she ignored it. Her world had narrowed to this spot, this moment, and the unspoken question hanging in the air. What are you looking for? As if in answer, Jasper let out a hoarse bark, scrabbling wildly at a patch of disturbed earth. Maple lunged forward, digging alongside him, while Harvey stood over them, his body tense and watchful. The crowd pressed closer, eyes wide, hands over mouths. Somewhere a child started to cry, and an old woman crossed herself, whispering prayers. Cassie felt helpless, caught between her duty as a cop and her empathy as a human being. She wanted to protect the dogs, to pull them away from their own pain, but something told her not to interfere. This was their mission, not hers. Suddenly, the earth caved in with a sickening squelch. Jasper fell halfway into the hole, barking and whining, paws scrabbling against something hard. Cassie lunged to grab him, hauling him back just as the others surged forward, frantic to see. The crowd gasped as the edges of a coffin emerged from the mud. Splintered wood, steel handles, dirt packed tight around the seams. Cassie's breath caught. Already? The grave had only been filled days ago, the soil still fresh. Why was the coffin so close to the surface? She wiped mud from her hands and peered down, her heart hammering, and then she saw it. The coffin lid, wrenched open, hinges bent, the inside empty. No body, no shroud, just claw marks on the wood, and a fistful of faded white flowers scattered in the darkness. Panic spread through the crowd like wildfire. Someone screamed, "He's gone! They stole his body!" A man in a suit stumbled backwards, nearly falling. "This is cursed! Someone call the priest!" Cassie barely registered the shouts and the rising chaos. She was staring at the impossible. The grave was empty. Jasper whined, pawing at the coffin, nose buried in the hollow where Eli Foster's body should have been. Maple pressed against him, eyes huge with confusion and fear. Harvey howled, a mournful, broken sound that echoed off the marble stones and set every nerve on edge. The priest stepped forward, his Bible clutched in trembling hands. "Everyone, please back away. Let Officer Daniels handle this." But the crowd surged again, phones out, taking videos, muttering about grave robbers, ghosts, and dark omens. Cassie swallowed hard and reached for her radio, her voice surprisingly steady. "This is Officer Daniels. I need backup at Oak Hill Cemetery. Possible grave disturbance. Body is missing. Repeat, the body is missing." The response was immediate. Sirens wailing in the distance. The sheriff's SUV barreling up the hill, paramedics on standby. The cemetery transformed into a crime scene, yellow tape fluttering in the wind, the dogs corralled to one side, still refusing to be separated from the grave. Cassie stood watch over them, her uniform streaked with mud, hands shaking as the adrenaline faded. Maple whimpered, licking Jasper's wounds, while Harvey pressed his battered side against Cassie's knee. She felt tears pricking her eyes, not just for the horror of what they'd found, but for the way these three dogs, beaten, bloody, but unbroken, still believed in something worth fighting for. Was Eli ever really dead? The question pulsed in Cassie's mind, terrifying and electrifying all at once. Grave robbery? An inside job? Or something more sinister? Something beyond what law and logic could explain. As dusk settled, and the crowds were finally cleared away. Cassie crouched beside the dogs, letting them nuzzle her hands, feeling their trust, their sorrow, their restless hope. She whispered into the growing darkness, "We'll find him, I promise." But as she looked up at the empty grave, its secrets yawning wider than ever, Cassie wondered if some mysteries were meant to stay buried, or if, sometimes, it took a dog's heart to bring the truth clawing back into the light. The discovery of Eli's empty grave echoed through the town like the rolling thunder that now haunted the skies. Oak Hill Cemetery was closed off, yellow police tape snapping in the wind, reporters camped out by the entrance, and neighbors whispered behind drawn curtains. Cassie's phone rang off the hook. Calls from the sheriff, her captain, frantic townsfolk, and news stations hungry for a headline. But none of it mattered as much as the slip of paper with the cabin's address and the 3 dogs who watched her every move. It was Jasper's eyes, fierce, pleading, certain, that convinced her. The answer wasn't in the paperwork or the rumors. It was somewhere deep in the woods, where Eli's past and present collided. By noon, Cassie had cleared her calendar and gathered what she needed: flashlight, first aid kit, raincoat, her service pistol, and treats for the dogs. She checked the slip of paper again, tracing the scrawled directions. Mara called as she was packing up. "Cassie, you don't have to do this alone. Let the sheriff handle it." Cassie smiled, though her voice was tight. "He's not looking in the right places. I have to try." She hung up before Mara could protest further. She loaded Jasper, Maple, and Harvey into her battered SUV. Harvey limped, his old injury aggravated by the night's frantic digging, but when Cassie opened the door, he clambered in without hesitation, tail thumping once against the seat. Jasper sat upright and alert, his gaze never leaving the woods as they left the town behind. The drive north wound through back roads choked with new spring growth. Potholes threatened her suspension, and Cassie swerved around fallen branches, mind buzzing with possibilities. The dogs grew restless as they neared the turnoff, a rutted track nearly invisible from the main road. Jasper whined, pressing his nose to the window, and Maple let out a nervous bark as Cassie killed the engine and slung her pack over one shoulder. The trail was rough and overgrown, the forest thick with pine and tangled underbrush. Rain began to fall in fitful bursts, drumming on the canopy overhead, soaking Cassie's clothes as she trudged forward. The dogs surged ahead, Jasper in the lead, following an invisible scent trail. Every so often he'd pause, glance back at Cassie, and then move on with even greater urgency. The further they went, the more Cassie felt the weight of memory pressing down. This wasn't her first time in these woods. Years ago she'd lost her father here. Just a hunting accident, people said. But the shock and emptiness still haunted her. Every snapped twig and gust of wind made her heart pound harder. The past and present seemed to blur, fear from her childhood mixing with the adrenaline of the search. She stumbled over a root, catching herself on a branch slick with moss. Maple trotted back to check on her, eyes anxious, tail wagging weakly. Cassie patted her head and kept going. "Good girl, we're close, aren't we?" Jasper suddenly stopped and barked, the sound sharp and echoing through the woods. Ahead, partially hidden by overgrown ferns and brambles, stood a dilapidated cabin. The roof sagged under the weight of years, its chimney crooked, windows dark and empty. The air here felt wrong, charged, heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Cassie drew her pistol and approached slowly, motioning for the dogs to stay close. Jasper ignored her, racing up the steps and pawing at the door. It hung slightly open, creaking on rusty hinges. Cassie took a deep breath, steadied herself, and pushed inside. The smell hit her first, stale air, mildew, and the copper tang of something darker. The cabin was a single large room. Battered table, broken chair, a stone fireplace cold and black. Papers littered the floor, and the remains of a lantern lay shattered in the corner. Cassie's flashlight swept across the chaos. The dogs fanned out, noses low, searching for familiar scent. Maple whined at the far wall, where muddy paw prints led to a pile of torn blankets. Harvey sniffed a battered hat. Eli's, Cassie realized with a jolt, lying next to a blood-stained handkerchief. Cassie's breath caught. The blood was dry, but not ancient. Someone had been hurt here, and recently. She checked every corner, rifling through drawers, stepping over broken crockery. No sign of Eli, but everywhere she looked were echoes of struggle. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, a trail of muddy boot prints leading out the back door and disappearing into the thicket. Cassie's mind raced. Had Eli been hiding here, wounded, alone? Or had someone brought him here against his will? Why leave his hat and the bloody rag behind? She shivered, realizing the storm outside was intensifying. Wind howling through the broken window panes. Jasper scratched at a warped floorboard, barking urgently. Cassie knelt beside him and pulled the board loose. Beneath it was a battered metal box. Eli's old cash box. She pried it open. Inside were photographs, a faded letter, and a tiny pistol. The photos showed Eli and the dogs, smiling in front of the cabin, sometimes with strangers Cassie didn't recognize. The letter was addressed to Mara. She read quickly, her heart sinking with every line. If something happens to me, trust the dogs. They know I have enemies. I'm sorry for all the secrets, but it was the only way to protect what matters. Eli, a branch, crashed against the side of the cabin, making Cassie jump. She tucked the letter into her pocket and stood, heart hammering. She checked her phone. No signal. The dogs circled her anxiously, their eyes fixed on the darkness outside. "We need to go," Cassie whispered, barely able to keep the tremor from her voice. But as she stepped outside, she caught sight of footprints, fresh, deep in the mud, leading away from the cabin toward the old logging road. Someone had left not long before they arrived. Was it Eli or someone else? Someone who didn't want them finding the truth. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest in stark relief. Thunder rolled, and the rain came down harder. Cassie called the dogs, her voice lost in the storm, but they stuck close, drawn forward by scent and instinct. She pressed on, heart pounding, the weight of the letter burning in her pocket. The woods seemed to close in around them, trees crowding the path, shadows dancing in the flicker of lightning. Cassie's thoughts churned. Eli's warning, the blood, the empty grave. She realized now that nothing about this case was simple. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide the truth. Someone was still out there, and time was running out. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Jasper barked and bolted ahead, his body a blur in the rain. Cassie ran after him, the other dogs at her heels. She didn't know what they'd find, only that she had to keep going. For Eli, for the dogs, for herself. And as the storm howled and the darkness deepened, Cassie understood one thing with absolute clarity. The dead would not rest until the living uncovered the truth. The storm raged on, lashing the old logging road with rain and rattling the trees overhead as Cassie chased after Jasper. Her boots slid in the mud, flashlight beam bouncing wildly, breath ragged in her throat. Maple and Harvey ran at her heels, driven by the same instinct that had led them to the empty grave and the bloody clues at the cabin. Whatever the dogs sensed, Cassie trusted it now with everything she had. Jasper darted through a gap in the undergrowth and up a slope toward the edge of town. Beyond the tangled brush, Cassie saw the jagged outline of the abandoned Carter warehouse, its windows smashed, roof half collapsed, looming over the weeds and rusting fences. For years it had been the haunt of raccoons and rumors, a place nobody visited except to dare each other after dark. Now, in the flickering lightning, it looked menacing, alive with secrets. Cassie ducked behind a rotting crate and pulled out her radio, voice low and urgent. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels. I need backup at the old Carter warehouse. Possible suspect location. Approach with caution." Static hissed in reply, the storm interfering with the signal. She didn't wait for a response. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her gun drawn and motioned for the dogs to stay close. Jasper was already moving, slinking along the wall, nose twitching, hackles raised. Maple pressed against Cassie's leg, trembling but determined, while Harvey guarded the rear, eyes narrowed and focused. Cassie crept around the side of the building, her flashlight off, senses straining. Through a shattered window, she glimpsed movement. Two figures hunched over a table piled with bags and papers. Suddenly, Jasper barked, a sharp, furious sound that echoed off the concrete. The figures jerked upright, startled. One, a burly man Cassie recognized from old mugshots as Logan Pierce, notorious for scams and dirty deals, shouted, "Who's there?" The other, younger and leaner, darted for the back exit. Cassie took a deep breath, adrenaline flooding her system. "You can do this, for Eli, for the dogs." She burst through the side door, weapon raised. "Police, don't move!" Rain streamed down her face, hair plastered to her forehead. Jasper lunged past her, snarling, and Maple barked, blocking the man's escape. Harvey limped forward, growling, body low and dangerous. Pierce reached for something on the table, a crowbar, but Jasper was faster. He leapt, jaws snapping, knocking the tool from the man's grip. Pierce crashed into the table, sending bags flying. The younger man panicked, ran for the other exit, but Harvey planted himself in the doorway, teeth bared, daring him to try. Cassie's hands shook, but her voice was steady. "On the ground! Hands where I can see them!" The old lessons from the academy surged up. Take control, stay calm, never let them see your fear. Pierce hesitated, eyes darting to the dogs, then to Cassie's gun. He spat on the floor. "You wouldn't shoot me with all these witnesses, cop." But as Jasper snarled, teeth inches from his face, the bravado crumbled. He dropped to his knees, hands in the air. Cassie handcuffed him quickly, keeping one eye on the other man. "Don't move," she warned. "The dogs are trained." It wasn't exactly true, but tonight it didn't matter. As she finished restraining Pierce, Jasper sprinted toward a locked door at the back of the warehouse, barking frantically, claws scratching at the wood. Cassie's heart pounded as she followed, the other dogs at her side. She kicked the door, splintering it open. Inside was a small, windowless room, dark, stifling, and reeking of sweat and fear. On a filthy mattress, bound and gagged, lay Eli Foster. His clothes were torn, face pale and streaked with dirt, but as the light hit his face, his eyes flew open, alive, wild with relief and terror. Cassie dropped to her knees, hands trembling as she untied him. "Eli, it's Cassie. You're safe now." Jasper launched himself onto the mattress, licking Eli's face, whining and wagging his tail so hard it thumped the floor. Maple and Harvey crowded in, pressing against Eli's legs and chest. Tears welled in Eli's eyes as he hugged Jasper, voice raw. "I knew you'd find me, boy. I knew you'd come." He reached for Maple and Harvey, burying his face in their fur. Good dogs. My good, brave dogs. Cassie checked Eli for injuries. No broken bones, but deep bruises on his wrists and a nasty cut on his forehead. He clung to her hand, voice shaking. They kept me here. Said if I didn't sign over everything, they'd hurt the dogs. Take my house, my money. Logan Pierce. He's the one behind it all. He faked my death, bribed the undertaker, dug up the grave to keep up the lie. I fought him, but he choked off, looking at Jasper, pride shining in his exhausted gaze. Cassie felt fury and relief war inside her. She squeezed Eli's shoulder, steady and warm. You're safe now. The whole town's looking for you. Your dogs, they never gave up. Behind her, the warehouse filled with noise. Sirens, voices, the pounding of heavy boots as backup finally arrived. Officers swarmed the building, taking custody of Pierce and his accomplice. The scene dissolved into chaos, but at the center was Eli, alive, rescued, surrounded by the dogs whose loyalty had defied all logic and all odds. As Cassie led Eli out of the warehouse, the dogs circled him like a protective shield. The rain eased, and the storm began to break apart, pale sunlight spilling through gaps in the clouds. On the edge of the lot, Mara and a handful of townsfolk waited, faces streaked with tears and rain. As Eli stepped out, the crowd gasped, then cheered, rushing forward to embrace him and shower the dogs with affection. Cassie watched it all, her own heart finally unclenching. She knelt beside Jasper, scratching his ears, whispering, "You did it, boy. You saved him." Jasper leaned into her, tail wagging, the tension gone from his body. In that moment, Cassie realized she'd witnessed something extraordinary, a rescue born not just of police work or persistence, but of a love that crossed the boundaries between human and animal, logic and instinct. And as the town rejoiced, as Eli's family wept with relief and the dogs basked in overdue praise, Cassie looked at her own hands, muddy, scraped, but steady, and knew she would never forget what these animals had taught her. That loyalty, courage, and hope could find you, even in the darkest places. The storm was finally passing, and for the first time since Eli Foster disappeared, Oak Hill had reason to hope again. The Carter warehouse stood silent now except for the drumming rain, yellow police tape fluttering in the humid breeze. Squad cars idled out front, blue and red lights reflecting off puddles. Cassie sat on the back bumper of an ambulance. Mud streaked up her legs, her jacket torn at the elbow, hair wild and damp. Across from her, Eli Foster perched wrapped in a paramedic's blanket, clutching a cup of sweet tea that trembled in his hands. Jasper lay sprawled across Eli's lap, tail thumping, as Maple and Harvey pressed so close he could hardly move. The paramedics checked Eli's wounds and offered him water, but he seemed only to care about the dogs. "You saved me," he kept whispering, scratching Jasper's ruff, voice raw and cracking. "You found me. You didn't give up." Cassie blinked back tears, her adrenaline draining at last, replaced by relief so fierce it left her weak. She remembered every step through the woods, every moment of dread and hope, every time she doubted herself and nearly turned back. But the dogs, especially Jasper, had never wavered. Even battered and limping, they'd led her straight to the truth. As officers escorted Logan Pierce and his accomplice to patrol cars in handcuffs, the crowd outside the warehouse erupted into angry shouts. Neighbors and friends, once drawn by morbid curiosity, now cheered and wept, crowding close to see Eli alive and whole. Mara broke through the cordon, flinging herself at her uncle, sobbing, "We thought you were gone forever. They said you were dead." Eli hugged her fiercely, his free arm never leaving Jasper's neck. "It was close, honey, but I'm home." The sheriff, a barrel-chested man with a gravelly voice strode over, his tone stern, but his eyes warm with relief. "Daniels, you and these dogs are heroes. You saved a man's life and cracked the biggest fraud we've seen in years." He squeezed her shoulder, then knelt beside Eli. "You'll need to make a full statement. But for now, go home, rest. Let your family and your dogs take care of you." For a long time, Cassie just sat with Eli and the dogs. She watched the townspeople, some weeping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. She watched the crime scene technicians haul out boxes of forged documents, jewelry, and Eli's stolen belongings. She watched Logan Pierce, his eyes full of rage and shame, as he realized the game was finally over. And she watched Jasper, who refused to leave Eli's side even for a moment, his loyalty shining in every glance and touch. Later, at the station, Cassie and Eli gave statements. The evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, witness accounts, security footage, and the confessions that followed once Pierce realized the net had closed around him. Piece by piece, the whole plot became clear. Pierce had targeted Eli for his inheritance, forged documents to claim ownership of his estate, bribed a corrupt mortician to fake the burial, then kidnapped Eli and hid him in the warehouse, hoping to force him to sign over everything. But what none of them had counted on was the devotion of 3 dogs and the stubborn determination of a small-town cop who still believed in doing what was right. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving the world sparkling and raw. Cassie stopped by Eli's house to deliver his keys and found him on the porch, flanked by Jasper, Maple, and Harvey. He looked older, more fragile, but his eyes were bright with something Cassie hadn't seen before: peace. "Come sit," Eli called, patting the swing beside him. Cassie sank down, her body aching but her spirit lighter than it had been in weeks. She listened as Eli talked, about the night he was taken, about the threats and fear, about the hope that kept him alive when everything seemed lost. "It was the dogs," Eli said, voice steady. "I knew they'd never stop looking. They've always known me better than most people ever did." He stroked Jasper's ears, smiling as the dog laid his head in Eli's lap and closed his eyes, finally content. Cassie nodded, understanding more than she could say. She told Eli about the empty grave, the nights in the kennel, the wild chase through the woods. She showed him the letter she'd found hidden in the cabin. Eli's own words reminding her to trust the dogs, to trust love even when everything else seemed uncertain. "I've spent a lot of years thinking loss was just something you had to live with," Cassie said quietly, watching the morning sun catch in Maple's golden fur. "But maybe it's what brings us together too. Makes us braver." For a while they sat in comfortable silence, sipping coffee while the dogs dozed at their feet. News spread quickly. By noon, reporters from out of town were knocking at Eli's door, asking about the grave dogs and their incredible loyalty. People brought treats, flowers, even a hand-carved sign reading, "Heroes live here." The sheriff called later that day, his tone more gentle than Cassie had ever heard. "You should know, Daniels. The DA's got all he needs. Pierce and his partner will never see daylight again. You did good. The town owes you." Cassie hung up, heart swelling with pride. But all she could think about was Jasper's first howl at the funeral, the sound that had sparked everything. She knelt in the grass, scratching his ears as he nuzzled her face, and let herself cry at last. Tears for fear and relief, for grief and hope. As the sun set, Cassie lingered on Eli's porch, unable to leave just yet. She watched as neighbors dropped by with casseroles and baked goods, everyone wanting to see the man who'd cheated death, and the dogs who'd refused to let him go, Children took turns petting Harvey, who soaked up the attention, while Maple basked in every gentle hand and kind word. Jasper, for once, seemed utterly at ease, his body loose, his eyes soft and joyful. Cassie sat beside Eli, their shoulders touching, feeling the peace of a home restored. She realized she no longer felt haunted by her father's absence or the darkness of the past few weeks. Instead, she felt rooted in something solid, something that would last. That night, as she said her goodbyes, Cassie knelt one last time and whispered to Jasper, "You kept your promise. You brought him home. Thank you." The big German shepherd leaned into her, a deep, satisfied sigh in his chest. Truth and justice had finally returned to Oak Hill. The scars would remain, but so would the hope. Renewed, shining, and alive in every wag of a tail and every act of loyalty that followed. The days that followed Eli's rescue drifted by in a warm, golden haze, the kind that only settles over a town when the worst is finally over. Oak Hill began to breathe again. Stores reopened, neighbors chatted at the bakery, and even the oldest residents stopped crossing the street to avoid the foster house. The story of the 3 grave dogs spread like wildfire, not just through town, but across counties and eventually the whole state. News vans arrived, eager to film Jasper, Maple, and Harvey lounging on Eli's porch like royalty. Reporters snapped photos, kids pointed from the sidewalk, and letters from strangers, some as far away as Chicago and St. Louis, arrived by the armful, all saying the same thing. We've never seen loyalty like this. For Cassie, the world slowed to a pace she hadn't felt in years. She took time off from the station, at the sheriff's insistence, and spent most mornings at Eli's place, sipping coffee on the porch. The sun would rise over the oaks, painting the grass silver, and the 4 of them, Cassie, Eli, and the 3 dogs, would simply be. There was peace in those moments, but also a kind of quiet awe. One morning, Cassie arrived with cinnamon rolls from Lila's diner, only to find Jasper sprawled in the patch of sunlight by Eli's boots, eyes half closed. Maple dozed beside the rocker, tail twitching in her sleep, and Harvey snored softly under the porch swing. Eli poured her a cup of coffee, his hands steadier than she'd seen in weeks. He looked better, stronger, the lines of worry fading from his face. Cassie sat, pulling her knees to her chest, and watched Jasper stretch and roll over, grunting with contentment. She glanced at Eli, who smiled. "They sleep deeper these days," he said, stroking Jasper's head. "I think they finally know they're safe." Cassie nodded. She took a bite of pastry, thinking about all that had happened. The funeral, the storm, the endless nights in the kennel, the frantic digging, the warehouse rescue. She remembered the way fear had twisted in her gut, how every setback had felt final until the dogs showed her it wasn't over. Each time she wanted to give up, they pulled her forward. Jasper's insistent whine, Maple's worried eyes, Harvey's stubborn limp. Their faith had become her own. "It still feels impossible sometimes," she admitted, "that they never gave up on you, or on me." Eli sipped his coffee, gaze distant. "That's what love is, Cassie. It's not passive, not just waiting for someone to come home. It's a choice you make every day. Loyalty is action. Jasper, Maple, Harvey, they fought for me, even when everyone else thought it was over. Animals don't care about paperwork or logic. They care about truth, about family." Jasper nudged Cassie's hand, his nose cold and wet. She laughed, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. She scratched behind his ears, thinking of her own father, how he'd told her once grief doesn't disappear. It becomes part of you, but so does the love that caused it. She realized now that losing her dad had made her afraid to trust again, afraid to hope. But these dogs, and this old man beside her, had shown her the other side of loss. The possibility of healing, of finding family in unexpected places. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" she asked quietly. Eli smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes. But then I look at these three, at you, and I think, if life had been easy, maybe none of us would have found each other. Maybe we had to lose something to learn what it means to truly be loyal." They fell silent, the porch creaking beneath them, the dogs snoring softly. It was a peace built on scars, visible and invisible, but also on the courage it took to keep loving, even after heartbreak. The news of the dogs' heroism brought more than just visitors and letters. People began showing up at the town's animal shelter, asking to adopt older dogs or the ones nobody else wanted. Cassie watched as families walked out with wagging tails and hopeful grins, inspired by Jasper, Maple, and Harvey. At the cemetery, a steady trickle of people came to lay flowers at Eli's empty grave, paying tribute to the grave dogs who had refused to let their friend be forgotten. One afternoon, Cassie lingered after everyone else had left, sitting on the porch steps with Jasper's head in her lap. She felt the steady rise and fall of his breath, the warmth of his body against her knee. She looked out across the yard, sunlight slanting through the trees, and felt a deep sense of belonging she hadn't known since childhood. "I needed this," she whispered, voice trembling. "I needed to remember that loyalty isn't just about staying. It's about fighting, about risking everything when it matters most." She wiped her eyes, smiling at Jasper. "You taught me that." Maple climbed into her lap, flopping over with a groan, while Harvey leaned against her other side. The three of them crowded close as if to say, "We're here. We're not going anywhere." That night, Eli made dinner for all of them. Hamburgers for the humans, special stew for the dogs. They ate together, laughter echoing off the kitchen walls. Cassie realized that grief hadn't left her, but it had changed shape, grown softer. She looked at Eli, the dogs, and thought of everyone in town who now saw hope where there once was only fear. Later, as she got ready to leave, Cassie paused at the door. "Eli, do you think things will ever go back to normal?" He shook his head, smiling gently. "No, Cassie. I think we've got a new normal now. One where we remember what matters, where we carry each other's scars, and turn them into something good." The lesson was simple but profound. True loyalty is not passive. It's a fight for what's right, a light in the darkness. The scars of grief can open pathways to new love and unexpected courage. And sometimes, the greatest gifts come from those who can't speak, but understand more than words ever could. As Cassie walked out into the night, the air felt lighter, the stars brighter. She glanced back to see Jasper, Maple, and Harvey curled up together on the porch, Eli's hand resting on Jasper's head, peace finally settling over them all. In that moment, Cassie knew the story of the grave dogs would live on, not just as a tale of loss and danger, but as a beacon of hope and the kind of loyalty that could change a town, heal a heart, and teach the world what it means to never give up. A year had slipped quietly by since the chaos at Oak Hill Cemetery. The town had weathered another winter, another spring, and now, under a bright summer sky, Oak Hill prepared to gather once more, not in grief, but in celebration. At the heart of it all stood Eli Foster, a little thinner, a little grayer, but unmistakably alive. He wore his best shirt and an old blue tie, his hand resting on Jasper's head, Maple and Harvey flanking him with wagging tails and grins as wide as sunrise. The townsfolk had been planning this day for weeks. The mayor stood at a hastily decorated podium beneath the big oak tree, his speech fluttering in the breeze. Rows of folding chairs lined the cemetery path, filled with faces familiar and new. Kids darted between gravestones, giggling. News crews bustled quietly along the edge, careful not to intrude on what everyone felt was something sacred. At the center of the gathering, draped with a sheet, stood a life-size bronze statue. It showed Jasper, Harvey, and Maple in a protective circle, their heads lifted as if listening for something beyond human hearing. The statue, paid for by donations from every corner of the county, was more than just a monument. It was a promise that their story would never be forgotten. Eli stepped forward when the mayor called his name. He cleared his throat, voice rough but proud, and spoke into the hush. When I first came to Oak Hill, I didn't know what family meant. I'd lost so much, wandered so long that I thought maybe I'd run out of places to belong. But then I found 3 souls, broken, hungry, frightened, and I made them a promise. You'll never be alone again. I didn't save these dogs. They saved me. When everything was darkest, when I was lost and afraid, they fought for me. They never gave up. They reminded me that loyalty isn't something you say. It's something you do every day with your whole heart. His words hung in the still air. People wiped their eyes, even those who'd always claimed they didn't like dogs. Cassie, standing at the front with the sheriff and Mara, felt her chest tighten. She thought of every lonely morning, every uncertain night, every time she'd wondered if hope was worth it. Today, she knew the answer. Eli gestured for Cassie to join him. This town found hope because a few people and 3 amazing dogs refused to let go. Officer Daniels, you showed us what it means to follow your instincts, to trust even when it's hard. You brought me home. Thank you. Cassie shook his hand, the crowd breaking into warm applause. Jasper pressed close to her side, his eyes bright with mischief and wisdom. For a moment, Cassie closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. She'd changed, too, no longer haunted by grief, but guided by it. Her scars transformed into something stronger. The mayor signaled for the unveiling. Mara and 2 children from the animal shelter whipped off the sheet, revealing the gleaming bronze. Cheers erupted, camera shutters clicked, and for a moment, everyone was silent, just gazing, letting the statue's energy settle over them. Afterward, families lingered among the gravestones, telling the story again and again. Strangers knelt to read the plaque, which bore the inscription, "To Jasper, Maple, and Harvey, whose loyalty taught us all the meaning of love. May we follow their example, today and always." Cassie wandered through the crowd, feeling hands clap her shoulder, hearing thanks and stories from people she'd never met. A woman with a rescued greyhound pressed her hand. "My husband and I adopted Daisy because of those dogs. We just wanted you to know." Cassie's throat tightened. "That means everything. Thank you." Later, as the sun dipped lower, Cassie found herself by the old cemetery wall, looking out over the fields. She watched Eli on the porch of his house, the dogs dozing at his feet. Harvey was already snoring. Maple lay with her head in Eli's lap, while Jasper kept watch on the world with the serene patience only a dog can muster. Cassie turned to see a group of teens lingering at the gate, some familiar from rough patches with the law, some new. She smiled, calling them over. "Come meet Jasper. He likes new friends." The teens shuffled closer, uncertain, but Jasper greeted them with a gentle wag, sniffing hands, letting them scratch his chin. Cassie saw the tension melt away, saw a flicker of hope in eyes that had known too little kindness. From then on, Cassie started something new. Every week, she brought a rescue pup from the shelter to the cemetery, teaching at-risk teens how to care, how to trust, how to hope. She saw the change, slow and small at first, but steady as spring rain. Some kids returned every week, drawn by the simple truth that loyalty, once given, could heal wounds no one else could see. As dusk fell, the memorial crowd thinned. The mayor offered closing words about the power of community, resilience, and kindness. Eli took the microphone one last time, his voice steady and strong. I was lost, but I was found. Sometimes hope is a cold nose in your hand, or a friend who refuses to let go. In a world where we lose so much, what matters is how we love each other, how we show up again and again, no matter how hard it gets. Cassie stood with her arms around Maple and Jasper, feeling the weight of the year slip away. She caught the eyes of the crowd and stepped forward, her voice clear. If you ever see someone, two-legged or four, calling for help, don't ignore them. Stand with them. Loyalty changes lives. A ripple of applause spread, gentle and heartfelt. The sun slid behind the oaks, casting long golden shadows over the grass and stones. As the sky darkened, Eli headed home, his dogs beside him, their shadows stretching out over the porch. Cassie followed, heart light, peace settling inside her like a welcome guest. That night, as twilight painted the world in soft lavender, the three grave dogs curled together at Eli's feet. Cassie sat on the porch, watching fireflies rise from the grass, knowing that hope was not a fleeting thing, but a living promise, renewed every time someone chose to love, to fight, to remain loyal. In the gentle hush of the evening, with laughter and memory drifting on the air, Cassie knew the truth. The greatest mysteries in life were often solved not by logic alone, but by listening to the instincts of those who loved us, dogs and humans alike. In a world marked by loss, acts of loyalty and kindness could resurrect hope for everyone, and as Oak Hill drifted to sleep, the story of Jasper, Maple, Harvey, and the people who loved them lingered, a quiet light in the darkness, reminding all who heard it that no one is ever truly alone.